Hello everybody. Previously I walked you around the Ford Laser TX3 here. I quickly spoke about the ECU install and I said I'd update that in a later video. Well, this is that video. Just wanted to go into a bit more detail about how I installed it, why I installed it, and what I had in before that. So this is not really a how-to video, this is more of a how I did. So take the tips or the ideas that I did and then apply it to your own situation, but don't take this as the be-all end-all of how to install an ECU into one of these cars. So about in the year 2000 I installed a EMS or Engine Management Systems ECU, a dual sport. This worked well for the time. It was a half decent ECU. It was starting to get a bit old in about 2000, but I was a poor apprentice. That's all I could really afford at the time. Worked quite well, but in the last 20 so years or 23 years, yeah, technology has moved on. The reason I decided to move to the Haltech is that the EMS did not have all the inputs and outputs I wanted. I wanted to be able to replace the original ECU with the new one, so I had to go to something like a Haltech that had all the inputs and outputs that I required. The EMS also did not have ability to be tuned by computer. There was an option for it, but my one didn't have it. Because the EMS couldn't run the entire car by itself, it had to be run in piggyback. So it was sitting on top of the original ECU and only ran the injection and the ignition, and the original ECU ran everything else. So this was a bit of a problem because the original ECU wasn't seeing all the inputs that it wanted because they were going to the EMS, and it wasn't running certain systems like the boost light. However, the EMS allowed me to remove the airflow meter because it had an internal map sensor just like the Haltech. The EMS also had a very limited tuning potential, so it only had tuning points for each 500 RPM point, and you could only tune in vacuum, boost or cruise, so there was only the 3 points every 500 RPM. The more detailed maps of the Haltech allows it to run a lot more smoothly and more fuel efficiently. One of the other reasons I decided to move to the Haltech is I wanted to run sequential injection. So this car is wired with a batch fire injection system. So cylinders 1 and 3 fire together and cylinders 2 and 4 fire together. So I spent a few months planning the install. I was writing up multiple spreadsheets documenting the inputs and outputs of the original ECU and the Haltech, and working out all the wiring I needed to change and what needed to be added, what connectors I needed. So yeah, that took months and months of planning, but it's one of those fail to plan is a plan to fail. So I only had a very limited time to be able to do the install, so I wanted to make sure I had everything ready to go, and really it only took me a couple of weeks to do the actual install. So I've got the original workshop manuals from Ford. I bought them from Ford, all 4 manuals for this car, including the TX3 supplement, and so I was able to photocopy and modify the diagrams, as you can see here. Allowed me to work out what connectors actually needed to go to what wires I needed. So with making the wiring loom, I actually cheated a little with this original loom. What I did is I went and got a wiring loom from a lower model laser. It was a 1.8S, I think. So it had all the injection, had most of the bits that this car has, and I was able to strip out all the cabling I didn't need and then add the cables I did. So that reduced the amount of cabling I needed to do while still having a functioning cable. So this is a temporary solution. In the future I intend to completely strip the cable out and custom make from scratch, because I wasn't overly happy with how this one worked out. Difference is this one I used loom tape to cover it, and I want to move to something like a braided sheathing, which will look a little bit neater. So I'll just go through the cabling. So the main wiring loom comes out just underneath the charcoal canister there, and it comes up to here where it splits off. One side goes this way, which goes up to where the fuel injector relay and ballast resistor used to be, and also the controller for the knock sensor. So I've replaced this original bracket that held the NOx sensor and relays on. So I've modified this bracket so it now takes the new map sensor, external map sensor, and holds the wideband controller on a 3D printed bracket there. This here is just the controller for the charcoal canister, which should probably get removed in the future. The other side of the wiring comes down here and it splits off underneath the battery. So one side goes up to the coils and the fuse box and the boost controller just down here, and the other side comes up underneath, and this is what leads to the injector loom. So the injector loom starts here. This is the cam angle sensor. There's a couple of other solenoids, so that's got to be removed. The solenoid was to control the fuel pressure, so change in fuel pressure. When the original ECU dictated, this one doesn't need it. It's eventually going to have a fuel pressure regulator, the new fuel pressure regulator. It also breaks off into the injector loom, which this has all been rewired to do sequential injection. And eventually I want to move to a cam angle sensor on the front of the engine, which will run down here and into the front. With the sensors, I'm using the same coolant temperature sensor and air temperature sensor. So the coolant temperature sensor is just here. This is originally from the EMS, so a good 20 odd years old. That's the air temperature sensor right here. I didn't know their calibration, so I actually had to calibrate them myself and find out so I could put the details into the Haltech, and so they're working quite well now. Other sensors that I'm using for the original factory throttle position sensor and the original factory idle control valve down here, I removed. There was a coolant controlled idle control valve here, which was messing around with the Haltech. It didn't like it, so I just took that off, and that's now a blanking plate that I've put on. So this idle control valve actually controls the idle really well. With the EMS, I already removed the airflow meter, but continued using the map sensor. I decided against using the map sensor in the Haltech because I wanted it closer to where the vacuum source is. That's mostly the reason why I put the map sensor there. Also, now I can use the internal map sensor on the Haltech for barometric pressure. This motor uses a combined crank angle sensor and cam angle sensor, which is mounted in the distributor here using a plate, but it's not very, so it doesn't have a very high resolution. That's why I wanted to move to a higher resolution cam angle sensor, which the later MX-5s use, which is mounted on the front of the crank. So that's a future job. The boost control is done by an unbranded boost controller. I don't know, that actually came with the car when I bought it, but it works fine. One of the major reasons of choosing a Haltech is that they have a really good wideband integration. So the wideband there controller, it's mounted in the exhaust pipe out, which is just underneath the engine here, all run by the CAN bus or the CAN system that the Haltech has, and it was just plug and play. It was really easy to install, and it's helped with the tuning. So that's what I'm doing a lot at the moment, driving around, just getting the long-term tuning done, so when we get to the dyno, hopefully they don't have as much work to do. The NOx sensor on this car, it did have a NOx sensor from factory, so the turbos all had NOx sensors. It was a Mitsubishi unit. It's quite a large little unit and had a separate controller, which is mounted up at the firewall. A couple of problems I had with the factory NOx sensor. I didn't know how it was controlled by the original ECU, so there was no way I was able to interface it or easily interface it with the Haltech. The other issue I had is that the original NOx sensor was actually mounted with an M10 bolt or an M10 thread, and most NOx sensors that you get, the little donut ones, have an 8mm through hole. So this was not going to work out. I couldn't bolt an M8 bolt into an M10 hole. So what I ended up doing, I made my own stud that had an M10 thread at one side and an M8 thread at the other, and the stud of the NOx sensor was able to fit on the stud, and that worked out really well. The NOx sensor's wiring runs up the back of the engine and comes up through the injector loom and out through here. The Haltech takes care of everything, including all the air conditioning controls. The air conditioning's not installed at the moment, it's got to be redone, and it controls all the cooling fans. Future plans for this car, plan on putting in coil packs or coil on plugs. So the distributor's running quite well at the moment, but I'm a bit worried that the the distributor thing in here is starting to wear, prone to cracking, and I just want to move to a more modern coil-on plug and maybe move to drive-by-wire. As you can see, I've got the original drive-by-wire. I'm going to go to an electronic drive-by-wire. Also need to upgrade the injectors because these injectors are maxed out, and that's just easy in this. With the Haltech, it's just plugging a different number into the inputs. Also thinking of running the fuel pump as a pulse width modulation, so that when we put in the fuel pump, that will require me changing the relay to a solid state relay. So this would be a video for the future. Once we have all the injectors and the fuel pump sorted, I'll be able to run this thing to the dyno and get it tuned properly so I'm able to drive it properly. When I originally installed the Haltech, it was still running in the NSP software, which is pretty good. It's much better than anything I had, but it was so slow to connect. It'd take like 2 to 3 minutes to just connect to the computer. But luckily, Haltech have changed to new NSP software, and yeah, that's much better, much easier to use. So it's just about everything I can think of at the moment. If I've missed anything you want to know about, please leave a comment below. Otherwise, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you next time.